Hi there. It's February 21st, and we're continuing our progress through the Good News of Mark, and we're in chapter 5, reading from verses 21 through to the end of the chapter in verse 43. So Jesus has crossed over the lake again. There seems to be a lot of going to and fro across the lake, perhaps to move in quietness to another place where there are not so many people. But when he arrives back on the other side of the lake, many people are crowding him, there are people around him. And as he is going along and people are with him, the leader of a synagogue comes. And his name is Jairus, and he comes to Jesus and he says, Jesus, my daughter is seriously ill. She looks as if she's going to die. And Jesus agrees to go with him. And so they move along. And as they move along, as I say, these crowds are pressing in around Jesus. We can picture the scene. But there's one woman, and this woman has had an issue of blood, it's called. She's had a hemorrhaging for 12 years. And it says she's spent she spent all of her money trying to get doctors to heal her. And she believes, and she realizes, or she says to herself, if I can only touch the edge of Jesus' garment, then I will be rescued, then I will be healed. It's a very interesting insight here on the part of this woman. No one's telling her to do this. Jesus isn't inviting her to do it. She just knows that if she reaches out, if she touches Jesus, there's something powerful about this image in terms of getting close to Jesus, intimacy with Jesus, that if she can only touch the edge of his garment, if she gets that close, the closer she gets, the more likely she is to be rescued. And so she touches Jesus' garment. She somehow reaches through the crowd and manages to edge forward and just touches him. And Jesus, it says, is aware of power, energy going out of him at that point. And he knows someone has touched him in faith. Someone has reached out to him purposefully. And he turns around and he says, who touched me? And of course the disciples are saying, Jesus, there's loads of people around you. You're being crushed and pushed all around you. What do you mean, who touched you? But this woman comes and it says she's trembling and she's fearful, and she falls before Jesus and she says, it was me. I just wanted to be healed. And Jesus said, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. And there's this beautiful picture of Jesus' compassion on this woman. Even though she sees it as though she's stolen something from him, Jesus in his grace has released it to her. But then messengers come from the house of Jairus and they say, don't bother the teacher anymore, your daughter is dead. Jesus says something very interesting to Jairus at this point. Imagine, he's heard this news that his daughter has died. But Jesus says, don't be afraid, just trust. Don't be afraid, just trust. How many times the scriptures say to us, don't be afraid? It's one of the most repeated commands of the scripture. Don't fear, don't be afraid. Fear is something that naturally grips us. Fear is something that we so often live with day to day. But Jesus says to Jairus, don't be afraid. Believe, just believe. And Jesus goes with Jairus to the house, and they find the mourners outside. And in Middle Eastern cultures, mourning is something that is very loud, very expressive. It's letting it all out. It's letting the fear out, letting the emotion out. And Jesus tells them to calm down because she's only sleeping. And then the weeping turns to derision and scorn. It says they scorned him for suggesting they know when someone's dead and this girl's dead. But Jesus takes with him his close disciples and the mum and dad of this little girl, and they go into the house. And quite simply, Jesus reaches out his hand and he says to her in his own language, Talitha kum, little girl, get up. He takes her by the hand and she rises up, she sits up, and she is alive again. And it says they were beside themselves. They were ecstatic is actually the word the Greek uses. They were ecstatic. They couldn't believe what had happened. But interestingly, Jesus is compassionate even here. And he says, give her something to eat. He's thinking about the little girl. He's not out for demonstrations of power. In fact, he says, don't tell people about this. Don't make a big thing of this. You think, my daughter's just risen from the dead. She's just been raised from the dead. How can I not make a big thing of it? But Jesus is not out for shows of power and demonstrations of power. He's out to restore, he's out to heal. His heart is compassionate towards this 12-year-old girl. She's not going to be a big, powerful person. He's even not wanting this to be a thing that pushes people to make the decision to follow him. There's going to come a pivot in a couple of chapters' time when Jesus reveals his full glory, but it's going to be on the basis of the revelation of his Father from heaven that he's the Son of God, not on the basis of miracles of healing and raising from the dead. You know, it's powerful to see Jesus' compassion at work here, both in the example of the woman with the hemorrhage who reaches out to Jesus, and in the example of the 12-year-old girl. And Jesus in both situations connects with them. Jesus in both situations looks them in the eye. Jesus is not just seeing them as objects of healing. He's not seeing them as objects of ministry. To him they are people, to him they are persons, to him they are loved and cared about. We need to be aware that when we are serving the Lord, when we are bringing his kingdom, that we don't see it as a function, that we don't see it as a stage show or something like that, or an act. Actually, what we're doing is we're connecting with the image of God in others. And this connection is really important because it's part of what God does. And for each one, he sees us individually and he wants to communicate his love individually through us to one another. Have a very good February the 21st.